Don't sign that. The words were quiet, almost lost beneath the soft clink of crystal glasses and the distant hum of rain tapping against the floor-to-ceiling windows, but they landed harder than anything spoken in the room that night. Daniel Whitmore's pen hovered midair, a sleek Mont Blanc poised above a contract worth $200 million, his signature just seconds away from sealing what his team had already called a flawless acquisition. Around him, executives in tailored suits exchanged confident glances, their voices low, their certainty absolute. No one questioned the numbers. No one ever did. Daniel didn't either. He didn't need to. For 20 years, his instincts had built empires, turned risk into certainty, and made him the man people trusted when everything was on the line. He was never wrong. At least, that's what they believed. And then there was her. Emily Carter stood just behind the table, a simple black and white uniform pressed neatly against her frame, a small order pad tucked under her arm like it was part of her, invisible in a room designed to ignore people like her. She had been refilling water glasses, moving silently between conversations that weren't meant for her ears, but her eyes hadn't followed the room. They had followed the report, line by line, number by number, until they stopped. Just one line. A single decimal point sitting slightly off, almost imperceptible unless you knew exactly where to look. Emily's fingers tightened slightly around the pen she always carried, the one thing she never left behind, as if it grounded her in a world that had once spoken her language fluently. She hesitated. Just a second. Long enough for doubt to whisper that this wasn't her place, that people like her didn't interrupt men like him. Daniel didn't notice her at first. Why would he? His attention was fixed on the future he was about to claim, the quiet satisfaction of another perfect move unfolding exactly as planned. The rain outside grew heavier, streaking the glass in blurred lines that reflected the city lights into something almost unreal. Inside, everything was controlled, predictable, safe. Mr. Whitmore, one of his partners, said, nodding toward the contract, "We're ready when you are." Daniel gave a small smile, the kind that came from certainty, not arrogance, though the line between the two had long since faded. His pen lowered slightly. And then, "Don't sign that." This time, everyone heard it. The room stilled. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned, not toward the contract, toward her, a waitress. Daniel's hand paused, just enough for curiosity to flicker across his expression before it settled back into something cooler, something measured. He looked at her for the first time, really looked, as if trying to understand how a voice like that had found its way into his world. Emily didn't step forward. She didn't raise her voice. She simply met his gaze, calm, steady, like she wasn't the one breaking every unspoken rule in the room. "There's a mistake," she said softly, her eyes drifting for just a moment toward the report before returning to him. One line. The silence that followed wasn't disbelief. It was something heavier, something closer to discomfort. Because for the first time in years, Daniel Whitmore didn't move. No one spoke for a full 3 seconds, and in a room where decisions moved markets, 3 seconds felt like an eternity. Daniel Whitmore slowly set the pen down on the table, not because he believed her, but because something in her tone did not sound like doubt. It sounded like certainty. His eyes narrowed slightly, studying her the way he studied risk, searching for weakness, for hesitation, for anything that would explain why a waitress thought she belonged in this moment. He found none. "A mistake," he repeated, his voice calm, controlled, but edged with something sharper underneath. Around the table, a few executives exchanged uneasy glances, while one of them let out a quiet, dismissive breath, the kind meant to restore order. "Sir, with all due respect," the man said, adjusting his tie, "this report has been reviewed by 3 separate teams. We are confident in every number." Daniel did not look away from Emily. "Which line?" he asked. The question shifted the room again, this time from dismissal to curiosity. Emily did not rush. She stepped closer to the table, careful, measured, as if crossing an invisible boundary she understood better than anyone else in the room. She did not reach for the document immediately. Instead, her gaze moved across the page once more, confirming what she had already seen. Then, quietly, she extended her hand. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before sliding the report toward her. It was not trust. It was control. If she was wrong, this would end quickly. If she was right, he did not finish that thought. Emily picked up the pen. Not his pen. Her own. The one she always carried. The movement was small, almost insignificant, but it drew every eye in the room. She did not explain. She did not defend herself. She simply turned the page slightly, angled it under the light, and pointed to a single line buried in the middle of a dense financial projection. Here, she said softly. The growth rate. One of the analysts leaned forward, already shaking his head. That is correct, he said quickly. We double-checked that figure against. Emily did not interrupt him. She just made a small adjustment. One number. 1 decimal point. The change was so subtle it would have been invisible to anyone not looking for it. She stepped back. Now read it again. The analyst frowned, irritated, but followed her instruction, his finger tracing the line as his lips moved silently through the numbers. Then he stopped. His expression shifted, slightly at first, then completely. Another executive leaned in, then another. The quiet confidence that had filled the room began to fracture, replaced by something colder. Daniel reached for the report, pulling it closer, his eyes scanning the line she had touched. Once, twice, a third time. The rain outside pressed harder against the glass, as if the city itself was holding its breath. That would change the entire projection, someone said, barely above a whisper. Not just the projection, another voice added, tighter now. The valuation. Daniel did not speak. He flipped back a few pages, then forward again, recalculating in his head with the speed that had built his fortune. Numbers that had felt solid seconds ago now shifted, realigned, collapsed into something entirely different. The deal was not just less profitable. It was dangerous. Quietly, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze lifting from the report to Emily. This time, there was no dismissal in his eyes. Only a question he was not used to asking. Not out loud. How did you see that? He asked. Emily's expression did not change. It was not hidden, she said. It was just never questioned. And for the first time in years, Daniel Whitmore felt something unfamiliar settle into the room. Not doubt, not fear, something deeper. The realization that being right for so long might have made him stop looking. The room did not return to normal. It shifted, subtly, but permanently, like something invisible had been moved and could not be placed back the way it was before. Daniel Whitmore closed the report slowly, his fingers resting on the page a second longer than necessary, as if he could still feel the weight of that single correction beneath them. Around him, voices began to rise again, but they were no longer confident. They were calculating, rechecking, quietly unraveling what had, minutes ago, seemed certain. One of the analysts cleared his throat, his voice careful now. We need to rerun the entire model, he said. If that decimal is off, then the projected returns over 5 years. He did not finish. He did not need to. Everyone understood. Daniel did not respond immediately. His gaze remained on Emily, studying her with a new kind of focus, not as a disruption, but as a variable he had failed to account for. Run it, he said finally, his voice low but firm. Chairs shifted. Laptops opened. Fingers moved faster than before, but with less certainty, like people suddenly aware that speed did not guarantee accuracy. The rain outside softened, the steady rhythm now quieter, almost distant, as if the world beyond the glass had decided to step back and watch. Emily did not move. She remained where she was, hands lightly folded in front of her, her posture calm, unaffected by the tension she had just created. She did not look around for approval. She did not wait for recognition. She simply stood. Daniel noticed that. He noticed everything now, the way she held herself, the absence of hesitation, the fact that she had not tried to explain more than necessary. It was not confidence. It was something else, something quieter. One of the executives turned toward her, his expression still carrying a trace of disbelief. Where did you learn to read financial models like that? He asked, unable to hide the edge in his voice. Emily glanced at him briefly, then back to Daniel, as if only one answer in the room truly mattered. I read what is in front of me, she said. Most people read what they expect to see. The words settled into the space between them, not loud, not aggressive, but impossible to ignore. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair as the recalculations began to populate across the screens. Lines of numbers shifted, margins narrowed, risk expanded. What had been a safe acquisition transformed, piece by piece, into something far more unstable. He watched it happen in real time. And beneath the shifting data, something deeper began to surface. A pattern, not just in this deal, but in others. Small assumptions. Repeated, unquestioned, reinforced by success. His success. This is not the first time, he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. No one responded. They were too focused on the screens, on the numbers that no longer behaved the way they were supposed to. Daniel's gaze drifted back to the report, then to Emily again. How long would this have gone unnoticed, he asked. This time, the question was not sharp. It was honest. Emily did not answer immediately. She looked at the table, at the contract, at the signatures waiting to be written, then back at him. Until it became too expensive to ignore, she said. The simplicity of it landed harder than any complex explanation could have. One of the analysts spoke up again, his voice tighter now. Sir, if we had signed this tonight. He stopped, swallowing the rest. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging what did not need to be said. He reached for his pen again, but not to sign. He turned it slowly between his fingers, then set it down beside the report, untouched. The decision had already been made. Not just about the deal, about something else, something quieter. He stood, the movement drawing every eye in the room, but his attention remained fixed on one person. Emily, he said, her name deliberate, measured, as if committing it to memory. Stay. It was not a request, but it was not an order either. For the first time, it sounded like something in between. The door closed softly behind the last executive, leaving the room quieter than it had been all night, but not calmer. The screen still glowed with recalculated numbers, each one a quiet reminder of how close everything had come to collapsing under the weight of a single overlooked detail. Daniel Whitmore remained standing at the head of the table, his gaze fixed on the shifting projections, but his mind was no longer on the deal alone. It had moved beyond it, tracing backward through years of decisions, reports, assumptions that had never been questioned because they had never failed loudly enough to demand attention. Until now, Emily Carter had not moved. She stood near the edge of the table, the same place she had occupied before, as if nothing about her position had changed, even though everything in the room had. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was precise. Daniel turned slightly, finally breaking it. Sit, he said, gesturing toward one of the empty chairs. It was the same chair one of his senior analysts had occupied just minutes earlier. Emily looked at it for a brief moment, then back at him. There was no hesitation in her expression, but there was no eagerness either. She stepped forward and took the seat, her posture straight, composed, as if she had sat at tables like this before, even if no one in the room believed it. Daniel noticed that too. He walked slowly around the table, not in a rush, not trying to reassert control, but recalibrating something internal that did not have a name. He stopped across from her, resting one hand lightly on the back of the chair in front of him. You said it was not hidden, he began, his voice quieter now, stripped of the sharpness it had carried earlier. That it was just never questioned. Emily nodded once. Yes. Daniel glanced down at the report again, then back at her. Why? The question was simple, but it carried weight. Not why the number was wrong. Why no one had seen it. Emily folded her hands lightly on the table, her fingers still, her voice steady. Because it looked right, she said. It fit the expectation. It confirmed what everyone already believed. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. He had built an empire on seeing what others missed. And yet, somewhere along the way, he had stopped looking at the small things. The inconvenient things. The things that did not fit the narrative of being right. And you do not have that expectation? He asked. Emily gave the smallest shake of her head. No, a pause. Then, softer, I cannot afford to. The words lingered. Daniel studied her more closely now, not just her confidence, but the edges of it, the discipline behind it. What does that mean? He asked. Emily's gaze dropped briefly to the pen in her hand, the one she had used to make the correction, before lifting again. It means if I assume something is correct without checking, I am the one who pays for it, she said. Not a team, not a department, just me. The simplicity of it cut through the room more cleanly than any analysis had. Daniel exhaled slowly, absorbing it, turning it over in his mind. Responsibility. Not shared. Not distributed. Personal. Absolute. He had known that once. A long time ago. before success had insulated him from the cost of small mistakes, before layers of people and processes had turned his decisions into something that felt distant from consequence. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, the movement deliberate, equalizing the space between them in a way that no one else in the company would have recognized. "Walk me through it," he said, not as a test, not as a challenge, but as a request. Emily did not smile. She did not react at all. She simply reached for the report, turning it slightly so both of them could see. Her finger rested lightly on the corrected line. "It starts here," she said quietly. And this time, when she spoke, Daniel Whitmore listened. Her finger did not move from the line. It rested there, steady, as if everything else in the report depended on that exact point, and in a way, it did. Daniel leaned in slightly, his attention narrowing, the rest of the room fading into the background until it was just numbers, paper, and the quiet clarity of her voice. "The projected growth rate is listed as 12.5%, Emily said, her tone even, almost gentle, as if she were explaining something simple. "But the underlying data supports 1.25. She tapped lightly once, not to emphasize, but to anchor the moment. Someone shifted the decimal. Daniel's eyes moved across the figures again, but this time slower, more deliberate, following the structure beneath the surface instead of the surface itself. "That would inflate the 5-year projection by," he paused, calculating, "nearly 10 times. Emily nodded. Yes. There was no satisfaction in her voice. No trace of being right. Just acknowledgement. Daniel exhaled through his nose, leaning back slightly, but his gaze did not leave the page. "And no one caught it," he said quietly. It was not a question. Emily did not respond immediately. She let the silence sit, the kind that allowed the truth to settle fully before adding anything more. "Then, they checked the math," she said. They did not question the assumption. Daniel looked up at her, something sharper in his expression now, not directed at her, but at himself, at the system he had trusted without hesitation. "And you did." Emily's shoulders lifted almost imperceptibly in a small, understated acknowledgement. "I did not know what it was supposed to be," she said. "So I read it like it could be wrong." The distinction was subtle, but it landed with weight. Daniel's fingers tapped once against the table, a habit he had not noticed in years, a signal that his mind was moving faster than his surroundings. "Walk me further," he said. Emily turned the page slightly, guiding his attention downward. "If this number is wrong," she continued, "then every projection that builds on it carries the same error forward." Her finger traced a path through the report, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to connect the structure. Revenue, forecasts, risk assessments, valuation. They all depend on this. Daniel followed, his mind reconstructing the model in real time, watching as the foundation shifted and everything above it adjusted accordingly. "So the deal is not just overvalued," he said. "It is unstable." "Yes," Emily replied. "It only looks strong because the starting point is incorrect." The room felt smaller now, more focused, as if the air itself had tightened around the realization. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief second, not out of frustration, but to recalibrate, to strip away the assumptions that had guided him into this moment. When he opened them again, they were different, clearer. "How often does this happen?" he asked, his voice lower now, almost reflective. Emily did not answer right away. She looked at the report, then at the screen still glowing in the background, then back at him. "Often enough," she said quietly. "Just not always in a way that is obvious." Daniel let that settle. Years of success had taught him to trust patterns, but not all patterns were visible at first glance. Some hid in repetition, in small, consistent oversights that never felt large enough to question, until they were. He reached for the report again, not to challenge it, but to understand it, flipping back to earlier sections, scanning for similar inconsistencies, his movements slower, more intentional than before. Emily watched him, not with expectation, but with quiet patience, as if she had seen this moment before, the exact second when someone realized that being right had made them stop checking. "You carry your own pen," Daniel said suddenly, his eyes lifting to hers, the observation seemingly unrelated, but not. Emily glanced down at it briefly, then back up. "Yes." "Why?" he asked. Emily's expression did not change. "Because I do not trust borrowed ones to be where I need them when something matters." The answer was simple. practical, but it held something deeper. Preparedness, ownership, a refusal to depend on assumptions. Daniel leaned back again, studying her in silence, the weight of everything she had just shown him settling into place. Not just the mistake, but the mindset behind. Seeing it, and for the first time in a long time, he realized the most valuable insight in the room had not come from the people he had hired to provide it. Daniel did not speak for a while after that. The room held a different kind of silence now, not the sharp tension from before, but something heavier, more deliberate, as if every sound had to pass through a layer of thought before it was allowed to exist. He looked down at the pen resting near the report, then back at the numbers that had once felt unquestionable. For years, he had built systems to eliminate uncertainty, layers of review, teams of experts, processes designed to catch exactly this kind of mistake. And yet, it had not been caught. Not because it was invisible, but because it had been accepted. He leaned forward again, resting his forearms lightly on the table, his gaze steady on Emily. "If you had not said anything," he began, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier authority, "this would have gone through." It was not a dramatic statement. It was a simple fact. Emily nodded once. Yes. No emphasis. No weight added. Just confirmation. Daniel let out a slow breath, his eyes drifting briefly toward the glass wall where the rain had nearly stopped, leaving faint streaks behind like something that had already passed but not fully disappeared. "And no one would have known," he continued. This time, Emily did not answer immediately. She looked at the report again, then at him. "They would have known eventually," she said, "just not in time to change it." The distinction settled between them. Timing, not just truth. The cost of seeing something too late. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly as he absorbed that, not resisting it, but measuring it against everything he had built. "You are not part of this team," he said after a moment, his tone thoughtful rather than dismissive. "You were not assigned to this. You had no reason to look." Emily met his gaze calmly. "I had a reason," she said. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. "Which is?" She glanced at the table, at the report, then back at him. "It was in front of me." The simplicity of the answer made it impossible to argue with. Daniel gave a faint nod, almost to himself, as if acknowledging a rule he had forgotten somewhere along the way. He stood slowly, walking a few steps toward the window, his reflection faint against the glass. The city lights stretched beyond, steady, indifferent, unchanged by what had almost happened inside this room. "When I started," he said, not turning around, "I used to check everything myself." His voice carried a different tone now. Not defensive, not proud, just honest. Every number, every line. Because if I missed something, there was no one else to catch it. He paused, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the window. Then the company grew, and I stopped. The admission was quiet, but it carried more weight than any statement he had made all night. Emily did not respond. She did not need to. Daniel turned back, facing her again, his expression clearer now, as if something had been reset rather than broken. "And somewhere in that process," he continued, "I started trusting that the system would see what I used to see." Emily tilted her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in understanding. "Systems repeat what they are given," she said. "They do not question why." Daniel nodded slowly, the truth of that settling into place. He walked back to the table, stopping across from her once more, but this time the distance between them felt different. Not hierarchical, not fixed, just space. "You saw something that an entire department missed," he said. "That is not normal." Emily's expression remained unchanged. "It is not unusual either," she replied softly. Daniel studied her for a moment, the weight of that statement unfolding in his mind, then gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Not of amusement, of recognition. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose it is not." He reached for the report one more time, closing it with care, as if it were no longer just a document, but a reminder. Then he looked at her, not as someone who had interrupted his work, but as someone who had corrected it. And in that moment, the balance in the room shifted again, not dramatically, not loudly, but in a way that could not be undone. No one rushed to fill the silence. Even the screens, still alive with recalculations, seemed less urgent now, as if the numbers themselves understood that something more important had already changed. Daniel Whitmore remained standing by the table, the closed report resting under his hand, not as a finished decision, but as a moment that had rewritten something deeper than a single deal. He looked at Emily again, longer this time, not searching for an answer, but measuring something he had not needed to measure in years. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. The question was different from before. It was no longer about the mistake. It was about her. Emily did not look surprised. She had expected it, the way she seemed to expect everything that followed from clarity. Her gaze shifted briefly to the pen in her hand, then back to him. "In places where being wrong was not an option," she said. Daniel's expression did not change immediately, but something behind it sharpened, as if he recognized the weight of that answer even without knowing the details. "That is not a typical answer," he said. Emily gave a small, almost unnoticeable shrug. "It is not a typical situation." The simplicity of it held. No explanation, no attempt to impress, just truth, delivered without decoration. Daniel walked slowly around the table again, stopping closer this time, close enough to see the fine details others would have ignored. The steadiness in her posture, the absence of performance, the fact that she was not trying to prove anything anymore. She already had. "You saw a structural flaw in under a minute," he said, "in a model built by people who do this for a living." Emily did not react to the comparison. "They had more information than I did," she replied. That made it harder. Daniel tilted his head slightly, considering that. More information, more context, more expectation, all of it narrowing the ability to question what seemed obvious. He let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. "And you had none of that," he said. "So you saw it clearly." Emily nodded once. "Yes." The answer was not proud. It was precise. Daniel looked down briefly, then back at her, something shifting again, not in power, but in perspective. "Do you know what this company pays its senior analysts?" he asked. The question hung in the air, unexpected, but not random. Emily did not answer, not because she did not know, but because the number was not the point. Daniel continued anyway. 6 figures. Bonuses on top of that. Years of training. Experience. He paused, then added, quieter, and none of them stopped that signature. Emily's gaze did not move. "They were not looking for it," she said. "They were looking to confirm it." The distinction landed cleanly. Daniel nodded slowly, as if something inside him had just aligned with a truth he had not wanted to name before. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a business card, placing it on the table between them. It was simple, white, minimal, the kind of card that did not need to explain who he was. "Come work for me," he said. No build-up, no negotiation, just an offer. The room seemed to hold its breath again, not because of the words, but because of how easily they were spoken, as if this was the natural next step. Emily looked at the card, then back at him. Her expression did not change. "I already do," she said. Daniel frowned slightly, just enough to show that this was not the answer he expected. "You serve tables in a restaurant I happen to be sitting in," he said. "That is not the same thing." Emily's voice remained calm. "It is still work," she replied, "and I still do it well." Daniel held her gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod, acknowledging the boundary she had just drawn without raising her voice. For the first time, the offer did not feel like a transaction. It felt like a test, not of her ability, but of his understanding. And in that moment, Daniel Whitmore realized something that no report had ever shown him. Some people do not step into power when it is offered. They wait to see if it is deserved. Daniel did not reach for the card again. He left it where it was, resting between them like a question that had not yet earned an answer. For a moment, neither of them moved. The room held a quiet balance, no longer defined by hierarchy, but by something more precise. Understanding. Daniel studied her, not with impatience, but with a kind of restraint he rarely practiced. "Most people would say yes," he said finally. Emily's gaze remained steady. "Most people are not me." There was no defiance in her tone, no challenge, just a fact, placed calmly into the space between them. Daniel nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something to himself rather than to her. "No," he said, "they are not." He picked up the card, turned it once between his fingers, then placed it back down again, this time closer to her side of the table. Not pushed, not offered again, just repositioned. "Then do not come work for me," he said. The words were unexpected, but they did not carry disappointment. They carried adjustment. Emily's expression shifted slightly, not in surprise, but in attention. Daniel continued, his voice measured. Come work with me. The distinction was subtle, but it changed everything. He did not elaborate immediately. He let the words stand on their own, giving them space to mean something different than the offer before. Emily glanced at the card, then back at him. What does that mean? She asked. Daniel leaned one hand lightly on the table, not to assert, but to ground the moment. It means you are not here to confirm what we already believe, he said. You are here to question it. He paused, then added, quieter, even when it is inconvenient. The room felt still again, but this time it was not tension. It was clarity taking shape. Emily considered his words, not quickly, not emotionally, but carefully, the way she had read the report. And when the answer is not what you want, she asked. Daniel held her gaze without hesitation. Then it is exactly what I need. The honesty in his voice did not rise. It did not push. It simply stayed. For a moment, Emily said nothing. She looked down at the report, at the single line she had corrected, then at the pen still resting in her hand. The same pen, the one she trusted. People say that, she said softly, until it costs them something. Daniel did not look away. It already has, he replied. There was no need to explain what he meant. The room, the deal, the silence that had followed her correction, all of it spoke clearly. Enough. He stepped back slightly, creating space again, not retreating, but allowing the decision to exist without pressure. You do not have to decide now, he added. You can walk out of this room and nothing changes. Emily looked at him, her eyes steady, searching not for weakness, but for consistency. And if I do? She asked. Daniel gave a small nod toward the report. Then next time, he said, you do not stand behind the table. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Position, visibility, responsibility, not given lightly, not offered easily. Emily's fingers tightened slightly around the pen, just enough to register the shift. She looked at the card again, then at the chair she was sitting in, then back at Daniel. The room felt quieter than before, but not empty. It felt aligned. I will think about it, she said. Daniel nodded once, accepting the answer without pushing for more. That is all I ask. He turned slightly, reaching for the report again, not to return to the deal as it was, but to rebuild it with what he had just learned. And as Emily stood, the chair moving softly behind her, the balance in the room did not return to what it had been before. It settled somewhere new, somewhere neither of them had planned, but both of them understood. The hallway outside the conference room felt different from the moment she stepped into it, quieter, softer, as if the noise of decisions and numbers could not quite follow her beyond that door. Emily Carter walked slowly, her steps measured, not rushed, her hand still loosely holding the pen that had changed everything without trying to. Behind her, the door remained closed, but not distant. What had happened inside was not something that could be left behind. It had already moved forward. Inside the room, Daniel Whitmore stood alone for a moment longer than usual. The report lay open again, but he was not reading it the same way. He traced the corrected line once more, not to verify it, but to remember it. A single adjustment, a small detail, and yet it had revealed something larger than the deal itself. He walked back to his chair, but did not sit immediately. Instead, he looked at the screens now, filled with revised projections, more modest, more honest, less impressive, and somehow more real. Send the updated model to everyone, he said finally, his voice steady, carrying through the room as a few team members filtered back in, quieter than before, more careful. And cancel the signing. There was no hesitation this time, no debate, just action, aligned with understanding. Hours later, the city had fully settled into night, the rain gone, the streets reflecting light instead of sound. The restaurant floor was calmer now, the dinner rush fading into the low rhythm of late service. Emily moved between tables the same way she always had, steady, attentive, unnoticed by most, exactly as she preferred. Nothing about her movements suggested that earlier that evening, she had stood in a room where decisions shaped entire markets. And yet, something had changed, not in how she worked, but in what that work now meant. A quiet awareness, a line that had been crossed, not visibly, but permanently. The door opened softly behind her, and for a brief second, she did not turn. She already knew. Daniel stepped into the restaurant without announcement, without the presence that usually followed him, his suit still sharp, but his posture different. Less rigid, more present. He did not look around the room like he owned it. He simply looked for her. When their eyes met, there was no surprise on either side. Just recognition. He walked toward her, stopping a respectful distance away, not interrupting, not assuming. I had them run the numbers again, he said. Emily nodded once. And Daniel gave a small, almost thoughtful smile. You were right, he said. Then, after a brief pause, more than I realized. Emily's expression remained calm, but her eyes softened just slightly, not with pride, but with acknowledgement. That tends to happen, she said. Daniel glanced briefly at the table beside them, then back at her. I meant what I said, he continued. About working with me. Emily tilted her head slightly. I know. He studied her for a moment, then reached into his pocket, pulling out something small and placing it gently on the edge of the table. Not the card from before. A pen. Sleek. Balanced. Precise. The kind designed for people who signed things that mattered. Keep your own, he said quietly. But if you ever need a better one. He let the sentence trail off, not finishing it, not needing to. Emily looked at the pen, then at him, her gaze steady, thoughtful. She did not pick it up immediately. Instead, she reached for her own pen, turning it once between her fingers, then placing it back into her pocket with quiet certainty. Only then did she take his. Not as a replacement. As an addition. Daniel watched that, understanding the difference without needing it explained. He gave a small nod, then stepped back, not lingering, not pushing the moment further than it needed to go. As he turned to leave, the restaurant lights reflected softly against the glass, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel Whitmore walked away from a deal knowing that what he had gained was not written in numbers. Behind him, Emily returned to her work, moving through the room with the same quiet precision as before. Only now, there was something else beneath it. Not recognition, not status, just clarity. And sometimes, that was worth more than being right.